just a minute. Thanks for your patience. We set, Rick?
You are all set, Your Honor.
Okay, I see the icon. Well, good morning, folks. This is Paul Reiber, Chief Justice, and glad to welcome you to another meeting of the Justice Reinvestment 2 project that is making such great strides. As usual, there's a live stream feed that is going out, so and that has already started. We'll go around the table, so to speak, in a minute to introduce ourselves, and then CSG has presentations. As you will note, we've got a break planned for about 10:40 this morning, and if while the presentations are going on, anybody has a question or a comment they want to make, use the hand icon if you can find it. But it's fine just to interrupt. Just speak up. Let your voice be heard, and we'll stop and take your question. The two things I wanted to mention: Sarah Friedman, our terrific leader from Council of State Government. Sarah had a baby girl in August, I think, and I know we all join in sending best wishes along to Sarah, who is obviously not with us because she's taking care of her infant this morning. The other thing is, I don't imagine there's a single Red Sox fan out there, is there? It's oh yeah, Senator Sears. I think you are, maybe, if I remember that
Well,
right.
yeah, 2 late nights on the
2 late
edge of my
nights, and
seat.
you're up with us at 9:30, Dick. Well done.
I am. It's amazing.
Well done.
Yeah.
Well done to the Red Sox, I might say. And I know perhaps not everybody has the same sentiment, but it's a banner morning in my household, I can tell you that.
Ours too.
Okay. So we'll go around. I'm going to just mention your first name, if you would, then identify yourself and the agency or the interest that you're here representing, and then and any feel free to make any comment if you have one as well. So we'll start with Rick. Rick is helping out with operations. Rick, just introduce yourself and let folks know how they can reach you if they've got technical problems.
Oh.
Hi, I'm Rick Swan. I work for the judiciary. I work primarily in Chittenden County on the criminal side, hosting the WebEx series for the courts. If you need to get a hold of someone, if you can't speak or you can't hear, you can send me a private chat. The lower right-hand corner of your screen should have a little chat button. You can send a message directly to me through that.
Okay. Thank you, Rick. Thanks for your help this morning. Madeline.
Good morning, folks. Madeline Dardo. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Council of State Government's Justice Center.
And Madeline will be presenting here shortly. And then I've got a phone number, 4702 something 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 70. Who's that?
Good morning. This is Angela Gunter. I'm with the Council of State Government's Justice Center as well. I am joining by phone this morning. I have some internet issues at my house.
Okay. Where are you, Angela?
I'm in Atlanta. Sorry, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia.
All right. Well, good. Well, thanks for calling in. Now I see your name. Okay, great. Alan.
Alice Nitka, Senate Judiciary Committee. I know you can't see me. I can't seem to get the video to work, but I'm on here listening. I'll try to do it.
But you can hear okay, Senator? You're
Yes,
all right?
I can. Yes,
All right.
thank you.
Thank you. Alan Cormier.
Morning, Al Cormier, Chief of Operations for the Vermont Department of Corrections.
Thank you, Al. Angela. Oh, Angela, we already spoke to you. Carl.
Hi, Chief Reiber. This is Carl Reynolds down in Austin, Texas. Haven't seen you in about 10 years.
Oh my goodness, Carl. Nice to see you. How you doing? Yeah.
I'm doing great. I've been with CSG for about 10 years now. I'm a senior legal and policy advisor, and I've been lightly involved behind the scenes with the team from CSG, so I thought I'd try to tune in today.
Great group, Carl. Very impressed with the work they do. You all do. Thanks for joining. Dale Crook.
Yes, good morning. Dale Crook. I am the Director of Field Services for the Vermont Department of Corrections.
Thank you. David DeMoro.
Good morning, David DeMora, Senior Policy Advisor with the Council of State Governments Justice Center.
Senator Sears.
Muted. Dick Sears, State Senator, Bennington County, Chair, Senate Judiciary, member of the Advisory Board of CSG Justice Center.
Dr. Aton.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Eitan Nasreddin Longo. I am a co-director of Fair and Impartial Policing and Community Affairs for the State Police, equity advisor for the Department of Public Safety, and chair of the Racial Disparities Advisory Panel.
Evan Meenan.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Evan Meenan, and I work in the Executive Director's Office of the Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs.
Falco Schilling.
Good morning. I'm Falco Schilling, the Advocacy Director for the ACLU of Vermont, here on behalf of James Lyle.
James Pepper.
Hi, James Pepper. I'm the chair of the Cannabis Control Board. Hope you don't mind me listening in today.
Not at all. That's fine, James. Jay Johnson.
Thank you, Chief Justice Reiber. Good morning, everybody. I'm Jay Pershing Johnson, the Governor's Legal Counsel.
Thank you, Jay. Jim Baker.
Good morning, folks. Jim Baker, the Interim Commissioner of Corrections.
Judge Grierson.
Good morning, everybody. Brian Grierson. I can still proudly say I'm the Chief Superior Judge for the trial courts. Thank you.
Karen Tronsgaard Scott.
Thank you, Chief Justice. I'm Karen Tronsgaard Scott. I work at the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, and my role there is as its Executive Director. Good morning.
Good morning. Kelly Doherty.
Good morning, everybody. Kelly Doherty, and I am Deputy Commissioner at the Vermont Department of Health.
Kendall Smith.
There we go. Sorry, I was having an issue with my mute button. Kendall Smith, Governor Scott's Director of Policy Development and Legislative Affairs.
Loretta Sacchi.
Hi, good morning. Loretta Sacchi, Council of State Governments. I serve as a policy analyst, and please forgive me. I'm having some tech issues, so I'm off camera.
Thanks, Loretta. Mary Jane.
Good morning, Mary Jane Ainsworth. I'm the Director of the Vermont Parole Board.
Matt D'Agostino.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Matt D'Agostino, Interim Deputy Commissioner, Vermont Department of Corrections.
Matt Valerio.
Morning. Good morning, Chief, and everybody else. Matt Valerio, Defender General.
Morning. Monica Weber.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Monica Weber. I'm the Administrative Services Director with the Department of Corrections.
Representative Grad. You're muted. it's not working, Maxine, just wave. That'll be good. Okay. All right. Sarah Robinson.
Good morning, all. Sarah Robinson, Deputy Director at the Vermont Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence.
Thank you. Scott Griffith.
Good morning, Chief. Good morning, everyone. Scott Griffith, Chief of Planning and Court Services here in the Court Administrator's Office, just sitting in as an observer this morning.
Susanna Davis.
Good morning, Susanna Davis, Racial Equity Director for the state.
Thank you. Who did I miss? Anybody out there that I skipped unintentionally or missed?
Chief, this is Representative Alice Emmons. I just on.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you. Anybody else?
Good morning. This is Ashley Messier, Executive Director of the Women's Justice and Freedom Initiative.
All right. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. I see. We're about, I think, on schedule. Anyone have any questions or comments before we get started? You know, if there are Tampa Bay fans out there, I'd be glad to listen. It's not going to do much good at this point, but that's all right. All right. So we'll turn to CSG. Madeline, are you going to lead off?
I am. Thank you, Chief.
Good morning.
Good morning. So I'm going to share my screen real quick, folks. All right. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful. So we do have a presentation for you all today, but the bulk of our meeting is really just going to be a discussion and hopefully some decision making for you all around your kind of recommendations related to your two remaining tasks of studying parole for older adults policy and then also reinvestment funding. So just really quickly, you all hopefully know by now that we are the Council State Government's Justice Center, a national nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works with all three branches of government. And we are here in Vermont working on the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, which is funded through the Bureau of Justice Assistance. And so, believe it or not, this is actually the third to last meeting of the Justice Reinvestment 2 Working Group before your second and final report is due to the legislature on January 15th. And then just a reminder here, you'll see that as you all already know, that our technical assistance will end with Vermont, sadly, at the end of this year, at the end of December. And as a refresher, so we, when we all reconvened in June, you prioritized 4 remaining tasks before that January 15th report is due to the legislature. The first one being just your ongoing oversight role of implementation of Justice Reinvestment 2. The second was to evaluate a policy of parole eligibility for older adults. The third is to develop funding recommendations for the upcoming budget cycle. And then the last is to continue conversations around the racial equity and sentencing analysis that our colleague Sarah Bostomsky is leading, and that we're really excited to talk more about in November with you all. And so, as I mentioned, as you see here, really, after we go through some of the regular data monitoring that we generally speak with you all about at every meeting, our primary focus is going to be to revisit the parole for older adults conversation, followed by hopefully a discussion about the policy options that you all may consider for your report in January. And then we'll move on to do something very similar with reinvestment funding, do a quick recap of where reinvestment funding is to date, and then talk about the recommendations that recommendation options for you all again to consider for your January report. And as the chief said, please don't hesitate to interrupt at any point with questions and be persistent if I happen to not see you. I don't mind at all. And so to get started with the data monitoring, this is a chart that should be very, very familiar to you all at this point. It shows Vermont's sentenced and incarcerated population over time. And so if you look at this this dotted blue line here, that's the status quo projected sentenced incarcerated population, not taking into any account the impact of your Justice Reinvestment 2 reforms or COVID-19. And then below that line is the orange line here, like kind of right, is your sentenced incarcerated population, the projections, but taking into account the projected impact of your Justice Reinvestment 2 reforms as our phase 1 team calculated way back in fall of 2019. And then kind of the real headline on this slide is your actual sentenced incarcerated population as of the end of August, which is about 900 people, significantly lower than both your projected population as well as your projected population, taking into account the anticipated impacts of your Justice Reinvestment 2 reforms. And just wanting to note here that this is about 11 people higher than April 2021. So just a very, very small increase since the lowest population level during the pandemic, which was in April of 2021. And so another very similar chart here, but this is for the community supervision population. Again, looking at that dotted blue line, what you'll see is that's the projected status quo community supervision population, not taking into account COVID or Justice Reinvestment 2 reforms. Just a reminder that because of the nature of Act 148 and the reforms that were included in that bill, our phase 1 team did not do impact projections for the community supervision population. So that's why you don't see that here. But you can look at this, again, that solid blue line, and you'll see where the community supervision population is as of the end of August, which is a continual decline. It's about 500 people less than even what we shared with you all for the end of March 2021. And so last month, we got a request for comparison data for states similar to Vermont to really try to better contextualize these snapshot population trends that we've been showing you for several months. And how we kind of heard those questions is, what are other states experiencing similar trends? What has been the impact of COVID-19 on their populations? And so, as you'll see here, we decided to take a look at Connecticut and Rhode Island, specifically because we do have access to their data, and they also are similarly situated to you all in several ways, including the fact that they have a unified correction system. And so this slide here looks at the total percent change in the sentenced incarcerated population there on the left, as well as the pretrial population on the right here between 2019 and 2021. In simpler terms, this is really meant to show how much each population has either increased or decreased from a point in time prior to the pandemic to now. And so to bring your attention to the chart on the left, you'll see that Vermont is really right in the middle as far as percent decrease in sentenced incarcerated populations go, between Rhode Island at 23% reduction and Connecticut at a 43% reduction, with Vermont being right at about 31%. Then if you look to the right, it's actually a little bit of a different story. And so the right shows changes to the pretrial incarcerated population. And you'll see that Vermont has actually seen a drop in a pretrial population that's more significant than what you see at Rhode Island at minus 7%, or the actual increase of 5% in Connecticut. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but a significant portion of this increase in Connecticut actually has happened in the last several months, so in 2021. So that's offset that kind of rate of change since 2019. And then here at the bottom, we actually just combine all of these two charts together. And this is the total decline in the total incarcerated population from 2019 to 2021. With Rhode Island declining 19%, Vermont 29%, and then Connecticut 31%. And so next we looked at total admissions over the same time period to try to dig a little bit deeper into what are some of the drivers behind this percent change. And so what you'll kind of see here is not very surprising, right, is that for Connecticut and Rhode Island, and what we anticipate we'll see with Vermont, is that the largest change in admissions is from fiscal year 2019 to 2020 as the court slowed down. And so, we just want to note that over here to the right with Vermont DOC admissions, DOC is in the process of creating a process for being able to break down admissions by pretrial and sentence individuals that they can share with us. So we will have this information for you in December, broken down in addition just general 2021 admissions data. But that's why you don't see it here, because it is a work in progress. And so then the last slide looks at basically the first 8 months of 2021 and what changes there might be to the total incarcerated population across these 3 states. And so what we've talked with you all about before, that states are really having conversations about how populations will change as courts come back online and things get to relatively back to normal. And so, there are concerns that there's going to be a steep increase in incarcerated populations. And then, the question that goes with that, obviously, is are there ways to safely avoid going back to pre-pandemic levels or higher for incarcerated populations? And so, to help provide some context for these conversations, we thought this slide would be good to basically look at the snapshot prison populations from all 3 states beginning of this year through August to see what changes have happened as things start to come back slowly back online. And so what you'll see here is that Connecticut, they have seen an increase in their population that primarily comes from their pretrial population, as we talked about before. Rhode Island has remained relatively steady over this 8-month period. And then Vermont's sentence incarcerated population has remained relatively stable. But we do see indications in just a slight uptick in the pretrial population in May and kind of moving on through June and July and August. And so are there any questions in the data monitoring section before we move on to talk about parole for older adults?
I have a quick question. This is Evan Meenan. My question was whether or not, and perhaps you didn't look into this, but in terms of the uptick in the pretrial population, or that slight uptick, were there certain offenses that tend to be correlated with that increase, or was it sort of just a generalized across the board uptick? Thank you.
Thanks for that question. You're correct. We did not look kind of at that next level deeper to what the offenses are for that particular uptick. We haven't focused as much, as I'm sure you all know, on the pretrial side of things in justice reinvestment too. So we don't have that information, unfortunately, available for you all today. But that's a good question. I think those are the type of questions that you all want to ask as you start to see these changes in your population trends over time. All right. So if there aren't any additional questions on data monitoring, we'll move on to the parole for older adults section of our work today. And so this section is actually going to be broken out into 3 different sections. We're first going to actually review, we received a request last meeting for information about other ways that states have approached aging prison populations beyond compassionate release. We do have some examples for you all that we're going to talk about today. After that, we'll go through just a really brief review of some of the key takeaways from the August presentation that we gave regarding parole for older adults, including just a quick review of the data analysis that we were able to do here in Vermont. And then finally, really the bulk of this is just going to be a review of the policy options that you all have to consider for your report to the legislature in January, and hopefully a really robust discussion about those options. And so first off, so as I mentioned during the August meeting, we did receive a request to look at other approaches for addressing aging prison populations beyond a compassionate release. And so what we found is that states have used different strategies, often in conjunction with a medical or a geriatric parole statute. And we have the 3 kind of primary approaches that we identified here. The first is retrofitting or building secure prison facilities that are really focused on providing a higher level of day-to-day care than what's provided in a regular, can be provided in a regular facility. The second is the creation of structured programming for older adults that provide age-specific care and reentry services and programming focused on well-being within the facility, but also often reentry, preparing folks for reentry when they leave the facility. And then the last is an innovative model actually in Connecticut that we're excited to talk with you all about, which is contracting with private providers to open up options for serving people in the community. And so starting with the first one, retrofitting or building new facilities, we do want to highlight that this is primarily what we found, or these are states that have taken this approach, have a larger aging incarcerated population than what you all have in Vermont, and they have invested significant resources in these facilities. The type of facilities have ranged from, for example, in Pennsylvania, they converted a former state hospital into a geriatric prison facility. Missouri took a different approach and they actually created enhanced care wings within their existing facilities, so not a separate standalone, but just did some retrofitting within their existing facilities. And then Virginia actually created a special needs facility that provides services for older incarcerated people, in addition to other folks in the prison population who may require specialized care of different types. And so then our second example is structured programs for older adults that provide age-specific programming, care, and reentry services. And so just want to note really quickly that these examples here are focused on programming and services rather than treatment or medical services. So they're not really meant to directly address the issue of the level of care that folks may need, but it's more just about what can you do to be able to maintain a level of wellness for the person within the facility. I apologize. That's my dog. I was really afraid this would happen, so this is for everyone. He wants to say hello. So these are really focused less on the medical care side of things and more about how you kind of can keep people to a high level of wellness within the facility and then also prepare them for reentry, knowing that they may need kind of specialized reentry services. And so the two examples we have here are of Ohio that provides wraparound services that are focused on community reintegration, and that includes nursing home placement. And then also Nevada, who has partnered with community organizations to really establish a program within the facility that's focused on mental, physical, and spiritual health for individuals and really kind of maintaining that level of wellness. And so then our final example is the model in Connecticut that I mentioned before. And so what we learned when we were looking into this is, Connecticut had an issue that I think is really similar to what we hear from you all that you're experiencing in Vermont, which is that there are not really nursing homes that are willing to accept referrals for folks coming out of corrections. And so after struggling to identify nursing homes that are willing to accept corrections and mental health referrals, Connecticut was able to identify a way to contract with a privately owned and privately operated facility that would specialize in these state referred clients. And so this facility is called 60 West, and it basically provides a nursing home level of care for folks outside of incarcerative or hospital settings. And we do want to, it's really interesting. So when we say incarceration or hospital settings, because this was actually done in partnership with their Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. So these two agencies came together. They both kind of had an identified need that they were not able to, they weren't able to refer folks that needed a nursing home level of care that they couldn't provide within their facilities to facilities that could provide that. And we're able to come up with a pretty innovative model to be able to increase their access to community placements. And most of the corrections residents who are in 60 West are people that were actually granted what's called nursing home release in Connecticut. It's under the discretion of the Department of Corrections Commissioner, and they are monitored by the Division of Parole and Community Services. And so these are, this nursing home release is fairly similar to the medical parole, or excuse me, medical furlough policy that you all have in Vermont. However, one of the things that's probably most exciting about this model is that it is the first facility of its kind that's approved for federal nursing home funding through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And so as a result, Medicaid is actually able to cover about half the cost of resident care at 60 West, which then results in really significant savings in that state contract to pay for services. And so this is possible under an exemption that many of you are probably already familiar of. That's a 1997 exemption around Medicaid reimbursement. And it basically allows for people who are technically in correctional custody to qualify for Medicaid reimbursement, provided that the care is actually done and received outside of a state or local facility. So it's really the person can still be technically in the custody of the state, but that care isn't provided within a state facility; it's provided outside of it. And because of that, they are then eligible for Medicaid reimbursement. So we were particularly excited to share this with you all, given, one, that it is an innovative model and they have successfully really been able to leverage that federal funding to help support what can be a pretty expensive population to serve and meet their needs.
Can I just quick question, Madeline? Dick Sears. In Connecticut, can somebody go back to prison? For example, if their behavior is such that they can't control them at 60 West, or if whatever condition got them to 60 West improved, or is it treated like another correctional facility? Like in Vermont, we transfer people between St. Albans and Newport and wherever, Springfield, etc. Is it treated the same way, or is it, once you're there, you can't be removed?
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that question, Senator. So they do have a process where somebody's reevaluated. So for instance, if they were initially evaluated for a higher level of in need of a higher level of care, a nursing home level of care, and they are then transferred to 60 West, they're reevaluated. And if, say, whatever condition it was that resulted in them needing that higher level of care does improve, there is an opportunity to send them back to the facility. So that is something that we did identify as we were researching this particular model.
Thank you.
And so one thing we really wanted to make sure that we spoke with you all about is that, like Connecticut, other states often use multiple different strategies, including compassionate release, as they're thinking about managing the needs of this population. So there's not really just one silver bullet. It's not build a facility or retrofit a facility or have a program or have a compassionate release policy, but it's really more about a state assessing, what their resources are, what the needs of their specific older incarcerated population are, assessing what collaborative partnerships could be developed between their health and human service agencies and community partners to really be able to employ multiple strategies to be able to provide the support that this particular population needs. And so you see some of these different strategies here that we talked about, pretty much all of them today. So agency and community partnerships, age-specific programming within facilities, age-specific reentry services, facility retrofits or builds when possible and or appropriate, compassionate release, and then also private contracts. And so moving on, that's a kind of a good segue to actually the next section of our presentation around parole for older adults today, which is just a quick review of what we spoke with you all about in August related to compassionate release and parole for older adults specifically. So we wanted to first note that, we use the term compassionate release, but there's actually two different types, right? One is parole eligibility based on age, and the other is parole eligibility based on a medical condition. Vermont currently has medical parole and medical furlough, so you actually have one type of compassionate release already. And then you are today kind of considering the adoption of the second type of compassionate release, which is based on age. And you'll see here that the goals of a compassionate release policy based on age are similar to the goals of one based on a medical condition, but with just a more specific focus on the aging prison population. So they are generally reducing correctional healthcare costs related to treating older adults, reducing the rising numbers of incarcerated older adults, providing access to a higher level of day-to-day care that these folks may need than what's available in an institution, and then also providing a humane alternative to continued incarceration for people suffering from age-related issues. And so back in August, we were able to provide you all with an overview of parole for older adults policies in other states. And there's just a summary of some of our quick findings here. 17 states currently have a parole for older adults policy, and only 4 states do not provide for some type of compassionate release. So these are very common policies across the country. Most states limit eligibility to people 60 or older and do not require that a person have served any set duration of their sentence. And then we also found that for particularly in parole for older adults policies, sometimes that they're not just actually based upon age alone, but there also has to be some kind of qualifying age-related infirmary, illness, or incapacitation. And then finally, we did find that it was not uncommon for state policies to include offense carve-outs, as well as requirements around victim notification and victim opportunity for input. And so as many of you remember, we were able to do a limited data analysis of the potentially eligible population for should Vermont pursue a parole for older adults policy. And you'll see some of these our primary findings here. So Vermont, we did find that Vermont's older incarcerated population has increased about 10% since 2015. When you dive into this population a little bit deeper, we found that of the 87 people who are currently incarcerated and are 60 or older, so using that kind of average age range that we found in other states, that also is similar to an age range that you all have considered in past parole for older adults policies. We found that of those 87 people who are of that age range 60 or older, only 18 have served at least 5 years, but not yet reached their minimum. So only 18 of those 87 people would kind of qualify for a case-by-case review under a parole for older adults policy that had criteria of being 60 or older and having served at least 5 years, but not yet their minimum. And then of these 18 people, about 77% are incarcerated for sexual assault or murder. And then most have been assessed as higher risk, although we do want to note that research does show that future criminality is generally inversely correlated with age. And so in general, what these findings did indicate to us is that the population in Vermont that would typically be eligible for compassionate release underneath the eligible criteria that we discussed with you does appear to be slightly different than states that may have larger incarcerated populations that have people that are serving longer sentences for lower level offenses. That being said, we do want to note that this doesn't really preclude that the fact that there could be people within your population that would benefit from this policy and that would that could be potentially would benefit from release into the community to meet a higher level of care or need. And so then just to wrap up our review, we did discuss how compassionate release policies are used and some of those challenges that can actually lead to what we see as widespread underutilization, both in Vermont and then also across the country. And so, as I mentioned before, compassionate release policies are generally applied on a case-by-case basis. So it's important to note that eligibility does not guarantee release. Nationally, as well as in Vermont, we did, as I noted, compassionate release policies are used infrequently. And there's a lot of factors that contribute to this underutilization. And so you can see 4 examples here. The first being extensive statutory exclusions, complicated processes that make it hard to identify folks or assess them, lengthy determination processes. And then the last one, which we talked about previously, we know is an issue, particularly in Vermont, which is basically where do folks go? A lack of post-release housing, healthcare, and other services in the community. So before we move on to the policy options for your consideration, we do want to note that, so when Vermont's potentially eligible population profile that we discussed before, those 18 people, are combined with what we know about the challenges of fully utilizing a compassionate release policy, this does indicate that should you all move forward with a parole for adults policy, it will have a relatively limited impact on your overall population. Your overall sentence incarcerated population. However, as I mentioned before, we do want to just be clear that this does not preclude that its usefulness as a case-by-case option to have on the books if a person's needs are more appropriately served outside of an incarcerative setting. So there's kind of a balance here that we do want to be really clear about, that this is not going to be a prison reduction tool for you all necessarily. But that being said, it can be an option on the books for a case-by-case consideration to meet individuals' needs. And so with that, it brings us to our review of the recommendation options. Are there any questions before we start to go over the options?
Yes, this is Evan Meenan again, and I had two questions, one of which I might have missed the answer to, but of the other states that have an age-related compassionate release program, how many of those states have offense carve-outs? In other words, are all offenders eligible, or are offenders who committed certain types of offenses ineligible? And then the second question was, you had mentioned that some of the states that have these programs have a higher number of adult offenders that are incarcerated. And I imagine that to some degree that would influence which type of option is most appropriate. And I wasn't sure like what the disparity was between those states and Vermont in terms of the population numbers of these types of offenders.
Good questions. Thank you for that. So as far as the offense carve-outs, we did see that, so it's not really blanket. We would actually probably have to go back into our review of different state statutes. There are some that don't have any offense carve-outs, and there are some that do. But to give you a more specific answer as far as how many, I think that's something that we can follow up with you on, because I'm not sure those specifics kind of off the top of my head, because it does vary state by state. Yeah, and it's an interesting question as far as the higher populations. If you look at states that do have larger incarcerated populations that may be employed through strikes laws or increased sentence lengths in the past, 30-ish years, you do see that you have folks in those states that are serving longer sentences for lower level offenses. And so they are reaching their 60s, their 70s, and still incarcerated for something that an offense that was maybe committed decades before, that may be a lower level offense than what you see, what we found in Vermont's population, kind of the limited population analysis that we were able to conduct. And so that kind of led us to basically kind of indicated to us that Vermont doesn't necessarily have the kind of the typical compassionate release population that we have seen in other states when we've been making these recommendations. But again, we just want to make sure this is a policy that we have recommended in other states. And so we want to make sure that, that, as I said before, that doesn't mean that there aren't people in your population that it would be appropriate to have case-by-case consideration, or that there are people that might not be or that would be in the future. I don't know if that 100% answers your question, Evan. Let me know how I did.
No, that was a very informative answer. Thank you.
Madeline, Jim Baker, if I can just weigh in for a minute, please, before the conversation happens about the policy option. I actually met with the executive staff, and I think it was actually one of the owners of 60 West several months ago. And we actually were working fairly hard on attempting to transfer an individual in our custody to 60 West in Connecticut as part of a medical furlough process. And we ran into all kinds of problems, to include, I believe the individual had a pretty extensive sexual assault history. We ran into all kinds of problems. to include Connecticut would not accept the individual to be supervised. Then we talked to them about potentially a business model here in Vermont where they would open up a wing in order to, especially the folks that needed that continuing care in a nursing home setting. And the business model and numbers just did not work for them. We have, since I've been here as commissioner, I can think of at least 3 or 4 cases off the top of my head where medical team staff work diligently trying to work with nursing homes in the state to take this population, and they're just not interested in taking the population. And in those cases, most of them, the victims of the abuse were within the family unit. And there was no support system there for them because those bridges had been burned. So I think it's really important for people to have that context as you start this conversation about a policy position on compassionate parole. Because, you know, what I would not want to see happen is that someone's paroled and then we're left with trying to find the appropriate setting for them, because it gets very complicated. And I know since I've been here, I think I've authorized furlough on probably a half a handful of individuals on a medical basis. And as I said earlier, working with the families was very difficult. In one case, it was as a result of the individual was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and his mom had made the request, and we made arrangements for him to have his last days with his mom at her home. But I just want people to be cautioned about this, because it's not as simple as paroling people. And the staff time it takes to work on this is very time intensive. So that framework for the conversation.
Did I just ask Madeline and Jim a question? Jim Baker?
Sure.
Do we have any idea of the population in Vermont that could take advantage of a 60 West where it be available, which would preclude all those concerns about victims' issues, et cetera, right? I think. And having no place to go because they burned the bridges. What would be the total numbers?
I don't know. I know, Madeline, if you dug that deep.
If somebody could, it would be helpful, I think, for a future meeting to have the numbers so that we can make a decision. You know, if there's 12 to 20, it might make sense for a separate unit. If there's only 4 or 5, then it would not be economical by any means to try to do an operation, you know, to have that type of facility available.
And thank you, Senator. And I think that kind of actually, goes back to an earlier slide about really just the need to kind of assess what your particular state's needs are and the needs of your particular aging population. And we look specifically at age. So we actually didn't have access to any information around the need around any medical information. So we don't have that number for you of how many folks could potentially take advantage of a 60 West type arrangement. But we think that these are really good. These are the conversations to have, I guess, is where I'm kind of going, is really looking at what makes sense in Vermont. Hopefully these examples can be useful of how other states have done it, and then you all are really able to then take a look at them and tailor them to your particular needs and resource level.
So the numbers are available. You can get those for us.
We don't have access to medical information. So what we were able to look at was just age. So with what we have, we would not be able to provide that information, unfortunately.
Chief, I think, and Senator Sears, I think what we can do, and I'm volunteering staff without asking him, our director of nursing recently left, and we're in the process of recruiting a new director of nursing. She had done an incredible amount of work in this space. So I just have to go back and see what information we have, but we can work with the medical teams as well.
Yeah.
We can work with our medical staff to come up with a pretty good number. But I can't commit to that right now because I just don't, with any level of expertise, know
Yeah.
what that
Well,
means.
so it sounds like it's doable for the next meeting. Something, you know, some measure of numbers would be doable for the next meeting, Jim.
Yeah, I apologize. I didn't realize I didn't have my video on either, so I apologize. Yeah,
That's okay.
I will ask staff to do that, Chief, for the next
Yeah,
meeting. And Senator, we'll get those numbers as well.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Madeline, I guess we're back to you.
All right, sounds good. All right, so the last part of the parole for adults section of the presentation today is really just to review the policy options. And I'll go through these and then stop sharing my screen. So hopefully you all can see each other and have a hopefully robust conversation about which direction you all feel comfortable in taking. And so the first policy option probably seems very familiar to you all. It's a recommendation that the legislature adopt a standalone parole policy for older adults that allow consideration for eligible individuals on a case-by-case basis. So this is similar to what you all have considered before in the legislature, where there's eligibility criteria based on age and time served. There is a consideration of victim notification and input requirements, as well as offense carve-outs. The second option is a little bit of a hybrid option, recognizing that you all do have that existing medical parole and medical furlough policy. If the view of the group is that this policy is not kind of encompassing the totality of the population that should be considered for compassionate release for that case-by-case consideration in Vermont, is there a way to basically look at this statute and make eligibility adjustments so that it does include kind of the full population that you all would like to consider for compassionate release? And so we have seen examples of this in other states, and we have an example here of Wyoming where they have kind of a hybrid age and medical release policy. And so this could look something like basically looking at your existing medical parole or medical furlough policy and adding in some eligibility criteria based on age or age-related illness. So you're not creating basically a separate process, a separate statute, and something kind of standalone, but you're working within what you already have to make sure that it's working the way that you want to and reaching the population that you all want to reach through a compassionate release policy. This is an opportunity as well to make sure that, you know, if there are adjustments that need to be made around victim notification or victim input, that is something that you could do here as well. And then option 3 is a recommendation that the legislature not pursue the development of a parole for older adults policy. We know this is something that has been kicking around with you all for a while. And so this option is basically a little bit of a pivot that says not the recommendation to not pursue this particular policy and instead explore other options, like maybe some of the ones that we talked about today, for addressing the needs of the aging incarcerated population in Vermont. And then the last option is really just in recognition that you all have we've heard there are very different opinions around this particular policy. And so it would be more of a, sorry, folks. It would be more of a recommendation that you all would basically report the results of your study to the legislature, but without a consensus recommendation for legislative action. And so you have all of these recommendations in the summary document that Loretta sent to you all. So when I stop sharing my screen, hopefully you can be able to pull up that summary document and see all 4 of them there. But before we do that, does anyone have any questions about these particular options? All right, well, I'm going to stop sharing. Sorry, I'm gonna stop sharing. Actually, turn this over to you all while I put my dogs in another room.
Okay. Thank you, Madeline. So The summary sheet is in the email that was sent out. And the policy options are 3 under the category of parole for older adults. Commissioner Baker has kindly offered, I think, comments to help frame this, and I wonder if someone and Senator Sears with a question that obviously is fundamental information, basic information that I think everybody needs in order to make a informed decision. So does anyone want to speak in favor of or in opposition to any of the 3 options, any one of the 3 options?
Hi, this is Falco Schilling from the ACLU. I'm happy to chime in here.
Thanks, Falco.
Yeah, and I will say that as we were discussing justice reinvestment, as it worked its way through the legislature in 2020, we were one of the organizations that was vocally supportive of a parole for older adults statute with age-based criteria. So we are continue to be supportive of option number 1, but also see a value of looking at option number 2 and in looking at possibly adjusting our existing statute as it relates to illness and possibly taking in age-related illness, possibly expanding it. So if the group were to move forward with either 1 or 2, we would be supportive of both of those, but also understanding that there is disagreement amongst the group. Option 4 also seems like it might be a reasonable option, since I don't know if we're actually going to be reaching consensus. So basically, in essence, we are supportive of options 1 and 2, but if there's not consensus, we would understand that the group might want to report out option 4. But I don't think we would be supportive of option 3, saying we do not want to move forward with consideration of one of these types of policies, if that's helpful for folks.
Okay, anyone want to respond to that?
This is Evan Meenan again. I don't know that I'm prepared right now to take a firm stance on many of these options. I think we've identified at least one data point that might help inform folks' positions. But I do have more of a comment or maybe a question. If either this group was leaning towards recommending option 1, or if the legislature was interested in pursuing something like option 1. I think that one thing that should be considered would be, instead of creating a brand new program, taking a look at some of the existing programs and figuring out whether or not minor tweaks to them could be adapted to serve this purpose. For example, option 2 already talks about potentially amending the compassionate release furlough program, but we also have some other programs that might be appropriate with some alterations, such as the general furlough statute that allows folks to be furloughed to obtain necessary medical services. Should the concept of necessary medical services include things like nursing home care for age-related issues or problems. So that's the suggestion, is to also not lose sight of some of our existing programs that might be able to be tweaked, as opposed to creating yet another new program.
So what are the comments about moving in that direction, amending existing programs rather than implementing a new one? Yeah, who's that? Jay?
Thanks, Chief. I guess my question would be, why would we need to amend if we have a program for medical parole and medical furlough? I think, from my perspective, aging out is not a policy priority for this administration. But if we already have a medical parole and a medical furlough program in place, why isn't that sufficient?
Anyone have a response to that? Is there something about the current, I mean, you all are deeper, or at least I would hope you all are deeper into this than my my understanding of it. But what is there something about the current program that's not satisfactory, has not demonstrated its capacity to address the problem?
What I will add to that
Representative,
is, oh,
yeah,
um,
Alice.
speaking from the legislative end in response to Jay's question, I think what it really comes down to is finding an appropriate placement for the person. We in my committee have looked at this issue over the past 6 years. We did some tweaking to the medical furlough and the medical parole to try to address a compassionate release. But we always come up against where is the person going to be housed? That seems to be the real issue. So I'm just giving it from a legislative perspective in terms of what we've heard from testimony over the past 4, 5, 6 years. So I don't know if that helps, Jay.
So what you're saying, it sounds like, is that it's not the nuts and bolts of the law as it currently applies to people who are aging and or have disabilities. It's rather a problem of housing and placement, finding a place for them to go. Is that what you're saying,
That's
Alice?
what we've heard in testimony in my committee over the years. And also really providing them the services, the appropriate services, because we know some of the families just can't do it for a variety of reasons that was stated earlier.
Yeah.
And nursing homes, particularly if it's a sex offender, because their Medicaid is in jeopardy, would not take a person. So that's what we've heard in testimony.
Yeah. What's your perspective on that, Jay?
I guess my perspective is that's a different issue than whether we should be talking about age-related parole. If placement, so if say they're coming out anyway, if they are eligible for medical parole or medical furlough, or their term is up, it seems to me placement is always the issue. And it seems to me to be a different issue than the question of should we go with age related release.
Well, it is very much, however, it seems to me complicated by age and disease and disability kinds of factors. I mean, that is different than placing an individual, I would think, who is healthy and otherwise able to get around. So it sounds like it is a special sort of category of folks that you're talking about. Falco, do you have a perspective on this? You spoke earlier.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. So the ACLU has long supported the idea of making sure that there is an age-related eligibility for parole considerations. And looking more practically at Vermont's programs, at least one thing that we have heard is it's very difficult for people to access the medical parole and furlough as they've been instituted under current law. So looking at ways to expand that eligibility so the criteria are not as stringent, and maybe find ways that we can find more appropriate housing for folks within community-based settings. And especially if there are ways that we can, find ways that the Medicaid dollars could be helpful in that and help provide more appropriate services, and maybe at a, depending on how the money works out, save the state some money, or at least be able to get some of those federal matching dollars. But so that would be our perspective, is we are supportive of having an age-based criteria for that consideration. It's not a guaranteed release in any form, but that as folks age and as we've seen excess prison sentences grow longer and longer, that's one of the concerns of mass incarceration, and that is a policy that we think we'd be supportive of, and as Madeline talked about, can be especially helpful on a case-by-case basis with a smaller population like we have here in Vermont.
Chief, if I could just weigh back in.
Yeah,
just,
Commissioner. Yeah, yeah, Jim.
I get concerned around these conversations because my short experience here as commissioner is we put policies in place and then expect corrections to follow through with the policies and almost putting us in an impossible position. You know, we've been exploring this for several months about what options are to place folks that we're describing here. And it's easy to say, well, we could find other options for them. We've been doing that, and there are no options. And so without legislation telling the nursing home industry, you will do this, we would be left with having to try to implement a policy that's almost impossible to implement. So with all that said, what I would suggest is we're spending a lot of time talking about what's the real impact here. I would suggest let us get back to you with some numbers, really figure out what the impact here is and how effective it's going to be. I know, I hear what people are saying on the age, and as a reminder, and I think, Falco, this is the point you're making, is that medical furlough now is not tied to age currently in the statute. It's tied to, and I'm paraphrasing here, not being an attorney, it's tied to public safety and the threat of the individual to reoffend. And I'm kind of paraphrasing this a little bit. But as I hear this conversation, it's not this simple. Then you got to consider Act 1 from 2009 around the release of sex offenders. And have they been treated? Have they been in compliance? I mean, it's much more complicated than just saying somebody aged out and we should have a medical parole for them. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done before we move forward with a legislative or a policy change in order for us to be effective in our jobs of returning people to communities. So I just I bring up this point.
Yeah, no, I think those are it sounds to me like you've struck the right chord here. Madeline, if corrections can get back to you with numbers in some order that is before the next meeting, can you recraft the options, recommendation options based upon the conversation that you've heard here this morning? Because I'm not sure these are the options that people are focused on.
Sure. So one thing that I did want to kind of clarify when we transitioned from the PowerPoint to the discussion, but was rudely distracted by my animals, is that, you know, just as far as the Justice Center and our role in this conversation, similar to how we were working with you all around midpoint changes to midpoint review and to earn credit for probation, we're really here to help facilitate this conversation. So we're not necessarily weighing in. These are not really our recommendations. They're your policy options that we kind of took from you all and then have really been workshopping with you all. As many of you know, we appreciate your time meeting with us over the past week to kind of workshop through these policy options. If the group feels like, you know, based on what they've heard today and the conversations that they had, that you all do not feel like you can kind of move forward with what's here and you want to revisit, we can continue to facilitate this conversation. The one thing I just do want to flag is that, you know, part of the reason we were trying to kind of have this conversation here today is so that we can help you all close out in December and have you all really be able to review your recommendation decisions and close out your final report so that doesn't fall on you when we leave. So that would be our only consideration as we think about kind of extending this conversation, is just wanting to make sure that as we are adapting and moving forward and we're helping you all facilitate where you want to go, that we're just mindful that the closer we get to that December, the harder it does get for us to kind of help you tie this up before January.
Yeah, Dick.
I would agree with the administration and others have talked about. I think option 3 is the right way to go, leading us into a direction of not pursuing a parole policy for older adults, but instead exploring options for addressing the needs of an aging incarcerated population. I really think that's the problem. A visit to Springfield a couple of years ago led me to somebody I had in my program 40 years ago. And I never felt that he was extremely dangerous, but he was a sex offender. And so the community would look at him as being extremely dangerous. He was using a walker. He actually recognized me, which surprised me, and made a comment about my weight. But overall, what is the appropriate placement for him? The solitary.
We lost you, Senator. Rick, can you help us get Senator Sears back?
Your Honor, I believe he's back now.
Okay, good.
Okay. I guess from my perspective, that's illustrative of a number of people who may be incarcerated and we don't have an appropriate place for them. And that's probably what led Commissioner Baker to look out of state, 60 West or East. So I think option 3 is the one we should explore and move forward with at the next meeting or the December meeting, because that's, we're going to get in trouble creating a compassionate release program. I've seen what's happened in other states and even on the federal level with a lot of, for lack of a better term, people who may not have been sick asking for the compassionate release. That's just
Okay.
my view.
All right. Option 3. Would you read option 3, please? The sheet I've been working from is I think an earlier list, not the same one that's in front of us here. What would you read off option 3 for us, please?
I can take care of that, Chief. So
Thank you.
option 3 says, recommend the legislature not pursue the development of a parole policy for older adults and instead explore other options for addressing the needs of the aging incarcerated population in Vermont.
Okay. Does anyone want to speak against this this direction that Senator Sears is promoting?
This is Falco Schilling again. So as I spoke to in my opening comments, that'd be the one option that we are not supportive of.
Yeah.
We do think this is something we'd like the state to pursue at some point in time. But if that means we end, around option 4, which is we can't come to consensus, we'd also understand that.
So your vote would be against this. Anyone else would vote against this? This proposal? Option 3 proposal. Anyone else would vote against that? Okay,
Chief
I'll take
Justice,
it. Yeah, please.
might I propose kind of maybe a hybrid proposal here?
All right. All right.
Just for consideration. So there could be, an option of looking at option 4, reporting the results of the working group's study without necessarily consensus recommendation. And we can add for your consideration in December notes on how folks, what kind of the breakdown of that decision looks like. And if there's any notes that say the ACLU would want to make sure the comments are noted in the report, we can do that, or any other working group member. But we could also tack on to that something about exploring the, in addition to reporting these results, basically encouraging the legislature to explore other options for meeting the needs of the aging incarcerated population. So basically bringing that back half of the option 3, maybe down to option 4. If there isn't an opportunity for kind of a consensus recommendation and the group does decide they want to go for a consensus recommendation. Again, this is all kind of up to you.
Madeline, could you read the language that you're speaking of, integrating the back half of 3 into 4? Could you read that for everybody to hear?
Sure.
What you're talking about?
Take a stab at this. So it would be report the results of the working group study of a parole policy for older adults to the legislature without a consensus recommendation for legislative action or inaction, and encourage the legislature to explore other options for addressing the needs of the aging incarcerated population in Vermont.
What do you say about that? I'm sorry.
Oh, and then along with that, we could make additional comments about the discussion of the group and the views of the different working group members as well.
Okay, so what do you say about that, Senator?
I'm fine with that.
Falco?
We would also be fine with that. I think that encompasses kind of where the discussion has gone and where the committee is looking. I just had concerns as an organization saying we had a consensus recommendation to the legislature not look at those policies. So I think the modified option 4 that was just, or the whatever modification that was just discussed would be something we could be supportive of.
Representative Emmons?
Yes, you saw my facial expression. I'm supportive of this, but what comes to my mind is we're assuming that these medical issues, be it dementia or cancer or really debilitating diseases, occur with our population of folks who are at least 60 years old, 70 years old, which makes sense, but there could be situations where we have a 40-year-old or 45 or 50-year-old that is in this position. And would they qualify for us looking at a different setting for them because they haven't reached an age related, though we haven't specified an age, but we're all assuming here that it's an elderly population. And there may be situations of a person that's incarcerated with some real severe health issues that, like Senator Sears was mentioning about the person here in Springfield that was using a walker and incarcerated. Do we limit it to an age?
Seems to me that that's a question of language that you wind up using. For instance, I would think that age related is different than elderly. And if you use age related, well, you could get legislative counsel to weigh in on that, but it might be more broad.
Chief, and to Representative Edmonds' point, the individual I referenced earlier that we medically furloughed to be able to be with his family in his last days, he was in his 40s.
Yeah. But, age related, everything's age related, isn't it? I mean, what's up? You could put a lot of stuff into that category. Jay, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chief. So I guess that's where my question then goes to, yeah, really that larger issue of, I completely agree with Senator Sears and the option 3 approach. The idea that we're not talking about it.
Yeah, it's amended, right? The
Well,
amended
with
option.
So with the amendment, I guess where I think for me it gets very muddy, and maybe I'm just dense, is the idea that we face this exact same issue with any number of populations in the prison population. So like Senator Emmons pointed out, I mean, Representative Emmons pointed out, you have, a mid-range of age where any illness could occur, heart disease or diabetes or cancer. You have any age, you've got some mental health issues where we're always struggling with what's the appropriate placement for the mental health population. We're already providing MAT to incarcerateds in the system as well as people under supervision. So, I mean, we're always dealing with some kind of medical health issue for any number of people in the system. So in some ways, I guess my question is, what's the difference? Because we're always struggling with the issue of appropriate care, regardless of age or condition in some ways. Where I get a little, so in the numbers that we just saw, 87 people in the system, 60 or older. That's out of a system of about 1,200 just in the facilities, I think. And of those, 18 would be eligible for some age-related release, regardless of health condition. But 77% of those are sexual assault or murder. That's Big 12 offenses. I'm not sure what the other 4 people are in for. But I feel like, you know, it's all there's so much involved, you know, like we all know now, the complexity of the population and the violence of the population, of course, makes all of these issues harder. So I just I guess, and that's my overall question is, we have these questions for big segments of the health of the incarcerated population, and how is this different, I guess, is my question. We can address it as it relates to a specific population, but we're addressing as it relates to any other, you know, population in the facilities at this point.
Well, we have a recommendation on the table. Are you opposing it, Jay?
I'm not opposed to it. I'm just not completely sure what it means.
Okay.
Sure, we can make
Well,
some sort of recommendation to the legislature to do something.
yeah. Okay. Anybody want to speak against it specifically? Because we've got to wrap this up according to our agenda. I don't want to shortchange anybody, but yeah.
David Demore, just one
Yeah, David.
comment.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think there is some conflation going on. You actually have a way to deal with younger people with serious medical issues. Medical parole is available. So I don't think that you have to necessarily attack everything when you're thinking about this, wherever you end up. But you do have some things available for, as the commissioner was saying, for people who are younger and who are very ill, in terms of the option of medical parole. So those things do exist. I think that the focus, or at least what we were asked to look at, was really looking at that issue of the age slash medical issues for older folks, given the cost and the impact. So I just want to keep those. I just want to recommend that you continue to see those. Excuse me, that you continue to see those as separate, because you do have some things in place already to deal with some of those issues, particularly for the younger folks.
Okay. Thank you, David. I'm not going to call for a vote on this, but it sounds to me that if I can put it this way, that by acclamation, there's an agreement that this is the amended option 4. Madeline says grafting the back half of option 3 onto 4, she read to us before, is what we're going to go forward with. And obviously it's going to engender further work down the road and discussion. Okay with that, everybody? All right. So we're a little behind schedule, but we're going to take a break. Let's say we come back at 5 minutes after 11. That's a 10-minute break. And we'll take up the next segment of the agenda. Thanks, everybody. Jim, it looks like you're headed to another job.
I'm hoping not for right now.
You got you. You've had quite a career. Let me just congratulate you on everything you have accomplished in your professional life. It's just very. I'm very grateful. I know. I mean, just say nothing about the Rutland. Your contributions to my hometown. As we are so very grateful for your initiative and
Well,
goodwill.
coming from you, Chief, that means a lot. Thank you.
Well, I mean it from the bottom of my heart. And so you're coming back to Rutland? Is that it? Is that what I hear, Commissioner? You're coming back? You're gonna.
No. I did. Although I love Rutland, Chief.
I know you do.
You
I
know
know.
that.
I
I love
appreciate
the
that.
people there, but it's time for me to spend a little more time on the golf course and
There you go.
see if I can get myself back up on skis this winter.
You deserve it. You deserve. What's the timetable?
My last day is the 19th of November.
All right.
The new commissioner will start on the 1st.
Yeah.
And I'll be in the background for those
Yeah.
18 days or so.
Yeah.
I plan on leaving a little bit of a roadmap on
Yeah.
these very issues that we're talking about here and other challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then I'm
Well,
hoping that you don't see my name in the paper ever again, Chief.
you have been a great contributor to our great state of Vermont, Commissioner Baker.
I love Vermont. I appreciate that. And
Well,
to this work right here, this is an example of why Vermont works.
it's
You can
true.
get this
Yeah.
number of
Yeah.
diverse people,
Yeah.
virtually into a room.
Yeah.
And sometimes the conversations aren't easy, but
Yeah. Yeah.
it doesn't break down into a tweeting war. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I do know what you mean.
Chief, I
Well,
told
yeah. Who's
Chief,
that?
I told the commissioner that
Oh,
I was
David.
thrilled for
David. Yeah.
I was thrilled for his retirement, but that I cried all weekend when I heard the news.
Yeah. You and me both. You and me both. But I mean, I knew it was coming. I knew it had to be coming around the corner. It's remarkable. Of course, our good friend Judge Grierson is done at the end of this month. Although we're going to hang on to him as much as we possibly can. I don't know. he's he's put his foot down about most of it, but I think we'll see him every once in a while. One of my friends down in Massachusetts, Paula Carey, who's the chief of the trial courts down there, I saw over the weekend. She's announced her retirement. I see Suzanne Young has announced. Oh my God, that was a blow. I didn't expect that. Suzanne, I've known for a long time. Terrific person. Done great work for the state too. And anyway, it's a time of transition, and that's that's life. That's okay. That's all right. So we'll get back on the horse, so to speak. You can't. We just took a break. We got to get back and ride out the rest of the ring. Everybody with us who I think so. I think so. Okay. Well, CSG is going to take up another topic that may generate some give and take, and that's good. And Madeline, I hope you're back. You had a chance to calm your dog, and maybe he or she would rejoin us. We'd be happy to have your puppy in the background. But go ahead, Madeline.
No, puppy has been put away to another space. Too much noise.
Puppy's in a cage. Okay.
Not a cage, just another room.
All right.
There's a pet though. A cat representative. Before we just really quickly before we go back into or move on to the reinvestment funding conversation, I did just want to do a kind of a quick recap to make sure we're on the same page. What we can do as CSG headed into the December presentation, because as we've kind of discussed before, we're hoping to really dedicate the November presentation to the racial equity analysis. There's a lot to dive in there. So we just want to make sure we have time to do it with you all. What we can do is basically combine those two policy options that you all talked about and get that in kind of a written format for your consideration. And then there was a lot of other nuance to that conversation as well that you all just had that I think we can also pull out, so that when you're looking at that recommendation, or when the legislature's looking at that recommendation, maybe there's a little bit more information about, you know, kind of the discussions that you all have had and what your intention is behind it, that we can also try to capture for your review in December. And then hopefully make any tweaks to that, so that then that's available to you all should you decide to submit that as your report in January.
Thank you,
that
Madeline.
sounds like
That
a
sounds good.
plan. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to reshare my screen. And we will move on into the second part of your recommendation discussion today, which is focused on reinvestment funding. Just for some context, so you all may remember that while we talked about recommendations around reinvestment before your last report, those are really our recommendations as the Justice Center. You all were not required by the statute to make reinvestment or for any type of funding recommendations for your January 2021 report. However, Act 148 does task you with making recommendations for your upcoming January 2022 report, which is why we're revisiting this today, but in a little bit of a different context. And so just as a reminder, there's kind of two ways we talk about appropriations to support Justice Reinvestment 2 efforts. The first is upfront investments. And so this is funding that's allocated by the legislature to support Justice Reinvestment 2. It's quote unquote new funding. The second is potential reinvestment funding. So these per your statutes in Vermont are savings from out-of-state prison bed reductions during the previous fiscal year. So those savings in the previous fiscal year are then available in the next fiscal year to be reinvested in community-based services and programs, again, per your statute. And this reinvestment funding, the expenditures have to be approved by the Joint Justice Oversight Committee, which we have here. And so as a recap, in fiscal year 2021, so the previous fiscal year, Vermont did make $900,000 in upfront investments in community-based supports and programs. And so, and you'll see that broken down, those upfront investments broken down here. It's $200,000 in domestic violence intervention programming, and that was through the Vermont Council on Domestic Violence. $300,000 to strengthen transitional housing options and advocacy through the Department of Corrections. And then $400,000 to target gaps in mental health and substance use community services for people on supervision. That money was in the Department of Mental Health budget, and there was a directive that it be split with the Vermont Department of Health alcohol and drug programs. And so that was the upfront, that $900,000 in upfront investments that was made in fiscal year 2021. There was, as you might remember, $360,000 identified from the previous fiscal years out-of-state bed savings available for reinvestment. And I actually really appreciate, I believe, Deputy Commissioner D'Agostino is here today to help answer some questions, because we do have a little bit of a new information for you about this $360,000. And so, as you might remember, when we talked about this previously, we had recommended and has spoken about this as going toward domestic violence programming. So that's either the focused deterrence program that pilot the DOC was exploring, or domestic violence intervention programming through the Vermont Council on Domestic Violence. We did recently find out that this funding, that it remained unspent at the end of the fiscal year. And so per kind of budget, kind of state budget policy was kind of absorbed back into the state general fund. Given that this funding became available at the same time as a significant amount of CARES Act funding. And so the good news about this is, and hopefully Deputy Commissioner D'Agostino will correct me if I'm wrong, this funding is actually now moving forward a part of DOC's base budget. And so it will be, while the previous year's fiscal year's $360,000 was kind of absorbed back into the general fund, there is a, for lack of better terms, new $360,000 available in fiscal year 2021 that when combined with the 417,000 available in out-of-state bed savings from the last fiscal year, actually gives Vermont a total of 770,000 in reinvestment funding available for fiscal year 2022. So that's a lot of years and a lot of numbers. Before we move any forward, I do want to see Deputy Commissioner or Commissioner Baker, if y'all have anything that you want to add to this, any corrections you want to make, because this is complicated stuff.
Yeah, I'm going to let Deputy Commissioner D'Agostino address it because no one here wants me talking about math. Madeline, okay.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Madeline. Yeah, unless folks have questions, everything on this slide is spot on. It very succinctly describes exactly what the funding levels are and where those funds are dedicated to.
Great, thank you. So then, as I mentioned, the real takeaway, which actually kind of isn't on this slide, is that you all do have 770,000 in reinvestment funding for fiscal year 2022. So as we were thinking about how to craft a recommendation based on some of the concerns that we've heard from you all about getting ahead of your own budget processes, or just otherwise having concerns about making budget recommendations at this point, we decided to take an approach that really doesn't look at where reinvestment funding or upfront investment funding should go. We're not going to kind of get to that level with you all, but more just says, should there be funding available? And that these, based upon your work as the Justice Reinvestment 2 Oversight Committee and your knowledge of Justice Reinvestment 2 implementation efforts, these are the buckets where funding should go in order to support those efforts. And so these are really broad buckets. And I'll go through them really quickly and then turn it over actually to David to talk a little bit more about some of them. So the first one is domestic violence intervention programming through the Vermont Council of Domestic Violence. This is something that we talked about previously in regards to the previous reinvestment funding, and this is to ensure that and upfront investment funding. And this is to ensure ongoing sustainability. The second is data collection and analysis capacity. We've talked with you all in Vermont a lot, and we'll continue to do so through December about opportunities that you have to make sure that data is available to you all for your ongoing decision-making, justice reinvestment and otherwise. And so this includes additional changes to DOC's offender management system as identified beyond what your subaward is paying for currently. And then the third bucket is when we heard as we were having kind of our individual check-ins with you all really strongly that you all felt there was a need for investment is community-based mental health and substance use services and criminogenic interventions for people with complex needs on supervision. So there's kind of two distinct buckets here. One is having the actual services, those mental health and substance use services on the ground, and then having those criminogenic interventions as well, and being able to really connect all of these so that you're meeting the needs of the really kind of complex folks that you have on supervision in Vermont. And DOC is currently, they can speak more about this if folks have questions, but DOC is currently pursuing a particular model that really gets at the heart of some of this work that will potentially need investment funding in the future. And then the last is housing related needs for people on or who are transitioning to community supervision. And while we talked about the reinvestment funding, that $360K being part of DOC's base budget, that transitional housing money that was allocated as upfront investment in the previous fiscal year is also kind of an ongoing part of DOC's transitional housing budget generally. And so while there may not necessarily be a need for additional funding in this area, we did hear from a lot of you as we were talking with you all that, in your particular corner of the criminal justice system, housing needs in general, whether they be transitional or permanent supportive, are continuing to come up for this population. So we didn't want to kind of take it off entirely. We did just want to highlight that there could be a need for kind of housing related investment in the future, even if it isn't necessarily transitional housing. And so with that, I want to turn it over to David to speak in particular about the first bullet and some of the questions we received there. David?
Yeah, thanks, folks. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
A few points. I'd actually like to talk in particular about domestic violence intervention, but I really want to talk about the integration of all four of these issues as I close that. But many of you will remember that I testified before both the House and Senate committees, oh God, over 2 years ago now. And I stated that Vermont had made a misstep in the defunding of community-based programs. For this reason, we'd had it as part of Justice Reinvestment 2. That's why the initial investment. The historical rationale, as far as I could tell at the time, was related to the fact that programs didn't work as they should. And that's a very fair critique because they didn't. But one does not expect community programs to improve by removing funding or providing programming that's untethered from the domestic violence world. It's a complex world. It's the equivalent of a physician telling the patient she can come back when she's better, and then he'll prescribe her the medicine. Now, if a program refuses to change, that's another issue altogether. But the result of this has been fairly devastating for community programs through the network in Vermont. And at the same time, Vermont has seen a marked increase in both the volume and the deadliness of domestic violence in Vermont. Fortunately, among other things, Vermont has received a very large grant to assess every part of the community and system response to domestic violence. The issue of domestic violence is not just a public safety issue, but it's really also a public health issue, particularly when we think of the impact on the adults and the children who are harmed emotionally, physically, and sexually. We are currently working and will be for the next 2.5 years with the Department of Public Safety and the Vermont Network, as well as the Center for Court Innovation, on improved program standards, the development of improved evidence-based programming, improved assessments, improved application procedures and requirements for programs, enhancement at every intercept that touches the issue. We're using an intercept model, starting at the community and assessing every aspect of intervention. So community, police, courts, supervision, corrections as in facilities, reentry, again, community supervision or community services. This includes looking at continuous quality improvement methods, determining appropriate oversight, and ensuring that programs are providing the expected services. Many of you actually sit on that working group as well. This can be accomplished, and people who specialize in the area can help make Vermont safer. But to that end, it's imperative that the legislature assure that the needed amount of dollars from reinvestment reaches the network as was intended in our justice reinvestment work. In conjunction with the new JR project, Vermont actually has the potential to be a national leader in this area, but not if it takes its eye off the ball. If they don't work to have appropriate evidence-based community services provided by community agencies who are part of the community they serve, it will not work. I do want to make one final point. My comments in no way are meant to suggest that Commissioner Baker's and the DOC's focused deterrence plan should not be part of the response. They are important. I'm simply saying that they're one part of a larger set of responses, not the only response. And that also involves a lot of innovative thinking. And I'm hopeful that that will be moving forward even as the commissioner's playing golf down the road, because it is indeed something that I think needs to be looked at and studied and probably replicated, not just in Vermont, but frankly across the country. But it's not the end all be all. It's one important piece of a larger systems response. And that's what we'll be just so you all know this. And that's what we'll be working on for the next 2.5 years in this other JR project that is specifically domestic violence related. Last but not least, the importance of these other three components really play into this as well. Too often Vermont says, we don't know. we don't have the data about this or that. Not that you don't want it, you just aren't able to get it. And so the data collection and analysis capacity has to increase. When we look at the issue of mental health and substance use issues, both in those who commit harm and those who are harmed, the need for the improved or additional dollars, rather, is a better way to say that, community-based mental health and substance use services becomes important. And when we look at the housing issues, that becomes important because right now, too often, and this is true across the country, the people who are harmed are the ones who are displaced. And that doesn't really make a lot of sense if we're serious about focusing on their trauma. So I wanted to basically give you this harangue for a couple of reasons. One is that a number of people on the working group are not folks who were around then. And so I want to make sure that people know the history and how we got here. And the second piece is that I think that there are two roads that are going toward improving this. One has to do with the focused deterrence and the work that DOC is doing, and one has to do with the Justice Reinvestment Project with the Department of Public Safety and the Vermont Network in terms of improving what's happening throughout the system. And so it's kind of an exciting thing, but the legislature really needs to make sure that the appropriate funding is available for those projects to move forward in the right way. Through reinvestment dollars, through the original investment dollars, through whatever it is, wherever you can find those dollars to be helpful. Madeline, I will shut up now.
Thank you, David. And so similar to the parole for older adults options, this option as well should be on the summary document that Loretta sent to you with meeting materials. So unless there are any questions that we can leave the slide up for, I would like to, again, kind of close out my screen sharing for discussion, the group.
I have a question. One of the previous slides indicated that there was perhaps some previously allocated funds that were left over that could be used to pursue one or more of these options, assuming I'm interpreting the previous slide correctly. And I just wasn't sure whether or not we had a sense for what the dollar value of each of these four options are, so that we would know how much that residual funding might go if we want to, if the state wanted to pursue more than one of these options.
Thanks, Evan. And actually that allows me to revisit something that I meant to discuss before. So I pulled back up the slide that I believe that you're mentioning, and it's that $360,000 that wasn't spent at the end of the last fiscal year. This funding, is not available, is actually went back into the state general fund. There is, because it's part of DOC's base budget ongoing, there is a quote unquote new $360,000 available for this fiscal year. We do recommend, and we have seen this in other states, that it is very difficult to responsibly and sustainably spend one-time funding during a kind of with a 1 year kind of a time clock on it, right? So one thing that we do recommend, and that we've talked to some of you all about, is the potential of actually, if it's possible, being able to allow that funding to carry over into the next biennium if there is any unspent reinvestment funds. It's our understanding that's not really possible in Vermont. So, but that being said, there is that $770,000, right? Because there's that kind of new 360 in base funding, and then that 417 from the prior fiscal year's bed savings. And so, to kind of circle back to your second question around individual kind of breakdown costs, we actually, as in the Justice Center, we did that for our own recommendations ahead of the last January report. And that's actually how you see, I've got to these like upfront investment numbers here of 200,000, 300, and 400. We did not pursue doing that this time around. One, because we didn't feel like we're moving a little bit away from our assessment period right now. So we didn't really necessarily feel like we had that level of detail of information to give you all specific numbers. And we also, just in our conversations with working group members, heard that there was some uncomfortability about getting to that level of detail, which is kind of why you see here on this slide that these are really just buckets without that kind of next level of detail around actual dollar amounts.
Okay,
Chief
Evan.
Justice Reiber, I hope I
Yep.
can offer just a few comments. Thank you.
Yep.
So I really want to thank David for his comments about the way that we are handling domestic violence accountability in our state, and just offer a few clarifying comments as well as maybe some opinion. Those of you who know me know I seldom hesitate to offer an opinion about just about anything. But what I want to really make clear is that we have this unprecedented opportunity before us in Vermont at this very moment. Thanks to a collaborative arrangement between the Department of Corrections, the Domestic Violence Council, which is the body in our state that's statutorily responsible for certifying community-based domestic violence response groups and programming, and the Vermont Network, we have been working with the National Center for Court Innovations for the past year to completely rewrite and overhaul the community-based standards that guide how domestic violence offenders are treated once they get referred to a community-based organization. And those standards were in sore need of modernization. I believe that this is what David was referring to when he talked about they weren't working. They were, I probably wouldn't say that quite the same way, but appreciate the sentiment behind that. They were outdated. The standards were outdated and the operations were outdated. But here we are today, we're on the cusp of adopting the new standards. In 2022, all of the community-based organizations will have to reapply for certification under the new standards. And we think that this will be a game changer in terms of what happens out in our communities with folks who are using harm and violence in their intimate partner relationships. There's great hope for improvement. And David is correct in knowing that the severity and frequency of domestic violence has certainly increased since we made the decision to defund these programs. We've talked about this before. These community-based programs have been operating solely on participants' fees. And so they've just hung on by this, the very tips of their fingernails. And so here we are today. We have this opportunity with Justice Reinvestment Funds to solidify a foundation for these organizations and for these programs, and to solidify a foundation of responding to domestic violence offenders in meaningful and helpful ways. Through that, we have the opportunity to improve the safety of survivors, of children in our communities, and of our communities as a whole. And we have the opportunity to move forward with the new grant that the network and the Council of State Governments and the Vermont State Police are working together on to really take a hard look at how we respond across systems to domestic violence in our state, and building out new systems that are far more responsive and have a bigger impact than what we're able to do. So this idea of making this investment is just incredibly important. Of course, I'm biased. This domestic violence and sexual violence is frankly all I think about. But we're in this place right now. We have the opportunity to fundamentally change how we work with people who cause harm in intimate partner relationships, and to do a much better job of helping those folks make the important behavioral changes that they need to make so that their families and communities are safer. And so those are my comments, and I appreciate your listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you. Madeline, there's, what are there, 4 bullet points under this option. Are you looking for some consensus about ordering those in terms of priorities?
I mean, that decision's up to the working group. I know we didn't originally intend there to be any kind of prioritization of this. It's more of just a list of buckets that the working group will hopefully decide, are appropriate to fund in the future or fund with future funding to support justice reinvestment too. Obviously, if there are thoughts on, additional buckets or something that's here, that's for you all to discuss. But we were, our original intention with this option is that it's more kind of a wholesale. Does this look like something that the working group would like to recommend?
Okay. Anybody have a comment or perspective about that? Whether there is something there that should not be included, or that there's something else that is not there that should be included?
Chief, can I just I just
Yeah,
want
sure.
to follow up on one point from Karen's.
Sure.
Just to put an explanation point on what Karen just said.
Yeah,
From
please.
corrections' standpoint, this is a moment in time that we shouldn't lose. And so, as she just described what's going to happen with the work from CSG, this is going to change drastically the way we supervise in the field for folks that are convicted of intimate partner violence. And that's where the work with focused deterrence that David talked about with John Jay College is going to come into play. It's leveraging resources in the community to use the community as the leverage against the individual to hold them socially accountable for what harm they did to the community. So I just want to emphasize that. So when you see, I think it's the third bullet down, we talk about more comprehensive work around crimogenic thinking and so on. That's where that's going to come into play, and what we envision moving forward, community supervision is going to look like. And as we just recently posted, and hopefully we get our staffing squared away, community corrections officers positions, and we're going to completely reprogram the way they approach supervision in the community. So I just want to add that because it's an important piece of the big conversation that's happening amongst all the stakeholders when it comes to that damage done in communities by individuals that cause harm within family units.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. Anyone else have a comment?
I suppose I have one more question, and I apologize if it's taking me a minute to understand these funding sources. But if one of the issues is that the domestic violence programming has been defunded to the point where it's relying on participant fees, is the money, is the reinvestment funding identified on slide 29 a sort of one-time fund that we would then spend and be back in the exact same position? And does that need to be explored in some way? Or is there an opportunity here for some type of ongoing funding to get away from this model that we somehow find ourselves in right now?
Madeline?
I'm actually wondering, David, would you like to speak to that? You might be better situated.
So the idea of reinvestment funding is that the changes in what a system is doing provides a decrease in spending in one area, allows for increased spending in the other area. That is expected to continue each year. What you have to guard against, and what some states do, sadly, you have to guard against a state saying, oh, good, we saved this money, and then not do anything with it, because then it fails. But no, the expectation would be that it would continue, and arguably that the pot would grow. Because if in fact the outcomes change the way we're talking about, you should be able to, as time goes by, have less and less people out of state, but you certainly shouldn't have to increase that. So what would be important would be to not then take those savings away. As long as the state does not do that, there should be the ability for ongoing dollars to do the kinds of things that people are talking about, and frankly, potentially increase dollars. We've seen a few states where I live in Connecticut, several, Washington State, a number of other states, where really over the course of 7-8 years, they've been able to increase the pot to do these alternative things. What we've defined as alternative, meaning not having the numbers of people incarcerated and having the kinds of services we know make a difference, have been able to do that for, well, some, for here it's been 15 years, but for other states it's been up to a decade. And then, as I said, there are some states who unfortunately were short-sighted in my view, and they just took the money and threw it away and did not increase the services. That doesn't work. So yes, there's the ability for ongoing sustainability. It will require people looking closely to make sure that money doesn't disappear somewhere.
I'd like to comment on David and the question as well. David's comments are well taken. Last week at the Justice Center Advisory Board meeting, this issue came up because many states say, well, we've got these expenses, whether we cut 20 beds or not cut 20 beds. We don't have the savings. Vermont's in a unique position because it has the out-of-state beds, and every out-of-state bed you cut, one could figure about 30,000. I did some rough figuring of this past week, and we were at 750 when we started Justice Reinvestment 1. We're down to, I think, was 145 today out of state. That's 605 beds less. And at 30,000 a year, that would be 18,150,000 if we had stuck with the reinvestment idea. I just hope that we look back to when we started this, the number of beds we had, and continue to subtract that number of beds and use that money until we get down to zero. Then it becomes a little more difficult. But I think it's important that we're in that unique position. Most states don't have that place to calculate the savings from. If
Okay,
that all
thank
made
you.
sense.
Evans, that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much for that.
Okay. How about other comments? Anyone opposed to this option as a recommendation in the final report? Anybody? Okay, then I think, again, sort of by acclamation, we can, Madeline, we can consider that to be included.
Thank you, Chief. And then we'll do a similar, take a similar approach with this as we will with the Parole for Older Adults. We'll summarize this information for your review in December and any additional feedback or adjustments.
All right. I think that brings us to next steps. Next steps for the working group. The next meeting is November 17. Hopefully everybody's got that in their calendar. That's a Wednesday. The Wednesday before the week of Thanksgiving. And the purpose of that is, Madeline has shared her screen, is to assess the findings of the racial equity. She said that that is what that meeting will be about, and identify potential policy options to address disparities within sentencing. I'll look forward to that, as I know all of you. And then the last meeting is December 14, which would provide for any final discussions related to this matter of parole for age-related adults, racial equity analysis and reinvestment funding recommendations, to review the final CSG wrap-up presentation, discuss and finalize next steps for the working group's January 15 report to the legislature, and conclude CSG's technical assistance for us on this program. Anybody have any questions about those items? And again, I hope everyone has the dates in their calendar that they can save against other things that are requested for scheduling. I want to thank CSG again for the fine work that they do, and appreciate Madeline, your presentations, and David, your presentation this morning. Thanks for the participation, everybody added. And if there's nothing further for the good of the order, we'll call it conclusion for this meeting today. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, folks.
Everybody.